You're not even really Dad's daughter, you know that, right? My sister said, smiling as she slid a white envelope across the table toward me. Happy birthday. I figured you'd want proof this year. The room went silent except for the low hum of the kitchen refrigerator, and in that moment I understood exactly what the main topic of my story would be. How family betrayal can be dressed up as a joke, how favoritism can rot a household from the inside, and how humiliation can be served with candles and cake. My name is Emily Harper, and this is the story of the night my own sister mocked me as another man's mistake on my 29th birthday, then laughed while handing me a DNA test like it was party confetti. I remember the way her voice landed, light and playful, like she just teased me about my outfit instead of questioning my existence. My mother didn't gasp. My father didn't stand up. They just looked at me, then at my sister as if waiting to see how I'd react, as if my response was the real entertainment. My sister leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms and added, "Relax, it's just a joke. You've always been too sensitive." The word sensitive followed me my entire life, like a stain they could point to whenever I flinched at cruelty. I felt my face burn, not with anger yet, but with that familiar mix of shame and disbelief, the kind that makes your body go still while your mind scrambles to keep up. I stared at the envelope, my name handwritten on it in my sister's neat, deliberate script, and for a split second I wondered how long she'd been planning this. Days? Weeks? Or was this something she carried around for years, waiting for the right moment to unwrap me in front of everyone I loved? The cake sat between us, pink frosting sagging slightly under the warm lights, the words "Happy Birthday Emily" written in looping cursive, and the irony of it almost made me laugh. Instead, I heard myself say very calmly, "Why would you do this?" My sister shrugged. "Because it's funny. And because Mom always wondered." That was when my mother finally spoke, her voice careful, rehearsed. "We all did, sweetheart. It's better to know the truth. Know the truth." As if truth was a favor. As if truth was something they'd been protecting me from instead of a weapon they'd sharpened behind my back. I looked at my father then, searching his face for denial, for outrage, for anything that would tell me this was a line too far. He cleared his throat and said, "Let's not make a scene." Those 4 words told me more than any DNA test ever could. I pushed my chair back slowly, feeling every eye on me, including my sister's, bright with anticipation. "So you planned this?" I said, not accusing, just stating. "On my birthday?" She smiled wider. "Come on, Emily. You've always been the dramatic one. If it comes back negative, we'll all laugh about it. If it doesn't..." She let the sentence hang heavy and cruel. "Then at least we'll finally know why Dad never treated you like he treated me." The room felt smaller after that, like the walls had leaned in to listen. I thought about all the birthdays before this one. All the candles blown out while wishes stayed lodged in my throat. I thought about how my sister had always known exactly where to press, exactly which doubts I already carried. I picked up the envelope, its edges sharp against my fingers, and felt something settle inside me. Not rage. Not yet. Something quieter. Something colder. "I don't need this," I said, placing it back on the table. "Not like this." My sister rolled her eyes. "See? Sensitive." My mother sighed, as if inconvenienced. "Emily, sit down. Don't ruin the night." Ruin the night. As if the night wasn't already ruined the moment my existence became a punchline. I sat back down because that's what I'd always done. I swallowed because that's what I'd been trained to do. And while they cut the cake and passed plates, while my sister told a story about a coworker who'd failed a test and everyone laughed, I felt the familiar weight of being the extra piece in my own family, the one that never quite fit but was kept around out of habit. My sister leaned over and whispered, "I ordered the test weeks ago. You should thank me. I'm brave enough to ask the questions you're too scared to." I didn't respond. I focused on breathing evenly, on not giving her the satisfaction of tears. Inside, memories began stacking up, lining themselves neatly, like evidence waiting to be filed. The time my father forgot my graduation but took my sister out to dinner for a promotion she hadn't even earned yet. The way my mother introduced us to neighbors, lingering on my sister's achievements while summarizing me as the other daughter. The countless jokes about how I didn't look like anyone else, how my hair was the wrong shade, my smile unfamiliar. They'd always said it lightly, with a laugh, the way people do when they want cruelty to pass as humor. That night, as plates were cleared and candles burned down to stubs, my sister stood up and raised her glass. To family, she said. Even the questionable parts. Laughter rippled around the table. I felt every sound like a bruise. When the evening finally ended, when hugs were exchanged and my sister squeezed me a little too tight, whispering, "Don't forget to mail it in," I walked out into the cool air alone. My phone buzzed with messages from friends who couldn't make it, cheerful and oblivious, and I realized how carefully isolated I'd been within my own home. I sat in my car for a long time, hands on the steering wheel staring straight ahead, replaying every word, every look. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I drove home, placed the envelope on my kitchen counter, and went to bed like it was any other night. But it wasn't. Something fundamental had shifted. Not because of the possibility that my father wasn't my biological parent, but because of how easily my family had turned that possibility into entertainment. As I lay there in the dark, listening to the city outside my window, I understood that this wasn't just about a DNA test. It was about years of quiet erosion, about being taught that my feelings were obstacles, that my questions were inconveniences, that my place was conditional. And for the first time, instead of wondering what was wrong with me, I started wondering how long they'd been preparing to push me out. Looking back, the birthday wasn't the beginning of the story, it was just the first time the cruelty was undeniable, because the truth is my sister and I had never lived in the same emotional household, even though we shared the same roof, the same last name, the same dinner table. From as far back as I can remember, she was the daughter who fit effortlessly, the one my parents understood without trying, while I was the daughter they tolerated with explanations. My sister, Rachel, was praised loudly and often, her achievements announced like headlines, her mistakes smoothed over before they could leave a mark. When she brought home a B, my mother blamed the teacher. When I brought home an A-, my father asked why it wasn't higher. It was never said outright that she mattered more, but favoritism doesn't need declarations, it survives perfectly well in patterns. Rachel got the bigger bedroom because she needed space to grow. Rachel got a car at 16 because she had more potential. When I asked why I couldn't have the same, my mother smiled thinly and said, "You're more independent, Emily. You don't need as much." Independence was the word they used when they didn't want to show up for me. I learned early not to ask for rides, not to ask for help, not to ask for reassurance, because every request came with a sigh, a pause, a reminder of how much easier Rachel was. At family gatherings, relatives commented on how much Rachel looked like our father, the same eyes, the same laugh, and then they'd turn to me and joke about where I must have come from, some imaginary milkman or distant cousin, and everyone laughed because it was harmless, because I laughed too. If I didn't, my mother would later pull me aside and say, "You make things awkward when you're so sensitive." Sensitivity became my flaw, my sister's shield. When she mocked me, it was humor. When I reacted, it was drama. When she excluded me, it was coincidence. When I asked why I was treated differently, my father said, "You're imagining things." Gaslighting doesn't always come as shouting. Sometimes it's delivered calmly, patiently, until you start questioning your own memory. By the time we were teenagers, the gap between us was no longer subtle. Rachel was the golden daughter, the one whose future was discussed like an investment, while I was the backup plan, the one expected to be fine with less. When college applications came, my parents emptied savings for her private tuition without hesitation, telling me I should consider a more affordable state school because money doesn't grow on trees. I took out loans without complaint, told myself this was just how families worked, that love wasn't a competition. Rachel, meanwhile, made a habit of reminding me where I stood. She'd say things like, "You're lucky mom and dad are so patient with you," or "If I were them, I'd be exhausted dealing with you." She said it casually, often in front of others, planting doubt like seeds and watching them grow. Even then, there were warning signs, moments that should have stopped me cold, like the time she joked at Thanksgiving that I was probably switched at birth, or the night she got drunk and told me laughing that Dad had once asked Mom if she was sure I was his. When I confronted my mother about it the next day, she waved it off. Rachel exaggerates when she drinks. Don't stir trouble. Stir trouble. That phrase became another leash. So I stayed quiet. I endured. I built a life that didn't rely on their approval, or so I told myself. I moved out early, paid my own rent, showed up to family events with a practiced smile, and accepted the role I'd been given because it felt easier than fighting for one I was never offered. Rachel, on the other hand, stayed entwined with my parents, calling daily, borrowing money without guilt, involving them in every decision. She was rewarded for her closeness. I was punished for my distance. And somewhere along the way, the idea that I didn't quite belong hardened into something ugly inside the family, something they all seemed to share except me. That's why the DNA test didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of whispered jokes, raised eyebrows, and unanswered questions. My sister didn't invent the doubt, she weaponized it. And my parents let her because it was easier to let her be cruel than to confront what that cruelty said about them. In the days after my birthday, my phone buzzed with messages that pretended nothing had happened. My mother texted recipes. My father sent a photo of his dog. Rachel sent a single message. Have you sent it yet? No apology. No acknowledgement. Just expectation. I placed the envelope in a drawer and tried to move on, but everything felt off like a picture hanging crooked that no one else noticed. Memories replayed with new clarity, and patterns I'd ignored sharpened into focus. I realized how often decisions were made without me, how often my absence went unremarked. I remembered overhearing my parents once discuss their real family, when they thought I was asleep, the way my name hadn't come up until my mother added, almost as an afterthought, and Emily too, of course. At the time I told myself I'd misheard. Now I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the DNA test wasn't about curiosity or truth. It was about control. If I wasn't really his daughter, then everything made sense, every slight justified, every exclusion explained. It would absolve them of guilt, turn years of favoritism into inevitability. And if I was his daughter, well, they could laugh it off, tell me I'd overreacted, add it to the long list of moments where I was told to calm down. Either way, I was the one on trial. I started noticing how often Rachel used humiliation as a bonding tool with my parents, how they laughed together at my expense, how their closeness depended on having someone beneath them. It was a dynamic I'd been trapped in for years, and for the first time I saw it clearly. Still, I didn't confront them. I didn't send the test. I went to work, paid my bills, answered texts politely, and carried the weight quietly, because endurance had always been my survival strategy. But something inside me was changing slowly, deliberately. The silence I kept was no longer confusion or fear. It was observation. It was memory. And as the days passed, as Rachel grew more impatient and my parents grew more curious, I understood that the story they'd been telling themselves about me was fragile, built on assumptions and convenience. They thought I would break or comply or beg for reassurance like I always had. What they didn't realize was that I was done asking to belong to a family that only valued me as a question mark. The pressure didn't come all at once, it seeped in through cracks, through comments disguised as concern and invitations that felt more like traps, until my silence became something they needed to break. Rachel started bringing up the DNA test casually in group settings, at brunch with extended family, during video calls with relatives I barely spoke to, always smiling, always framing it like a funny mystery everyone was in on. Emily still hasn't sent it, she'd say with a laugh, eyes flicking toward me like a dare. Guess we'll never know whose nose she got. People chuckled awkwardly, some looked uncomfortable, but no one shut her down. My mother would add, she's always been stubborn, as if this was just another one of my flaws on display. The humiliation became public, layered, repeated often enough that it started to feel normalized. Like this was simply the role I played now, the questionable daughter, the mystery everyone felt entitled to speculate about. One afternoon, Rachel posted a photo from my birthday on social media. A picture of the cake and the table, captioned, "Family secrets are the best gifts," with a laughing emoji. Comments rolled in fast, jokes from people who didn't know me well enough to understand how sharp they were, and Rachel liked every single one. When I called her and asked her to take it down, she sighed dramatically. "You're overreacting again. It's not my fault if you're embarrassed by the truth." I asked her what truth she meant. She paused, just long enough to let the implication settle. "Exactly," she said. That pause followed me for days. At work, I found myself distracted, replaying conversations, second-guessing memories I'd always trusted. I started wondering if coworkers noticed something off about me, if doubt showed on my face. That's the quiet cruelty of this kind of manipulation. It doesn't just hurt in the moment, it infiltrates your sense of self. Rachel knew that. She always had. She started calling more often, her tone syrupy, falsely concerned. "Mom's really worried about you," she'd say. "Dad too. They don't understand why you're being so distant." You're hurting them. Hurting them. The accusation was always inverted, my pain reframed as their burden. When I finally spoke to my mother directly, she didn't deny anything. We just want clarity, she said. If there's nothing to hide, why not take the test? I asked her why it had to be a spectacle, why it had to be my birthday, why it had to come from Rachel. She hesitated, then said, "You know how she is. She doesn't mean harm." I wanted to ask who they thought meant harm then, because it certainly wasn't Rachel in their eyes. It was always me with my reactions, my questions, my refusal to laugh along. The family dynamic tightened around me like a noose. Invitations stopped coming directly. They went through Rachel. Information was filtered. Conversations half-shared. I found out about my father's minor surgery from an aunt, days after it happened. When I asked why no one told me, Rachel said, "We didn't want to stress you out." The implication was clear. I was fragile, unpredictable, an emotional liability. It was another way to sideline me without admitting that's what they were doing. The worst moment came at a cousin's engagement party, crowded and loud, the kind of event where pretending is expected. I was standing near the bar when Rachel clinked her glass for attention. "Quick toast," she announced, smiling brightly. "To family and to honesty. Some of us are brave enough to face it, even when it's uncomfortable." Her eyes met mine across the room. I felt my chest tighten. People murmured, confused but intrigued. My father laughed nervously and said, "All right, that's enough." But the damage was done. Someone leaned toward me and whispered, "What's that about?" I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection, trying to recognize the woman looking back. I didn't cry then either. I washed my hands, fixed my face, and went back out because disappearing would have been exactly what Rachel wanted. Still, something cracked that night, not loudly but decisively. I realized how carefully orchestrated this was, how Rachel used public spaces to corner me, how my parents allowed it because it kept them aligned with her. Silence had stopped protecting me. It was now the tool being used against me. Rachel sensed it too. Her messages grew sharper. "People are starting to ask questions," she texted. "You're making yourself look guilty." When I didn't respond, she sent another. "Mom says if you don't take the test, Dad's going to assume the worst." That one landed hard because it wasn't a threat, it was a revelation. I saw then how easily they'd let doubt replace trust, how ready they were to believe the version of me that absolved them of responsibility. They wanted the test because it would finalize a narrative they were already comfortable with. Either I wasn't really his daughter and everything made sense, or I was, and my pain could be dismissed as overreaction. There was no outcome where I was simply treated with dignity. I started documenting things quietly, not with any clear plan yet, just instinct. Screenshots of messages, dates of conversations, comments made in public, the social media post, the way my father avoided my eyes now, how my mother spoke to me like a problem to be managed. Rachel, sensing my withdrawal, pushed harder. She showed up unannounced at my apartment one evening, sitting on my couch like she owned the place. "You're being ridiculous," she said. "Just take the test. Unless you're scared." I asked her why it mattered so much to her. She smiled, but there was something brittle underneath. "Because I'm tired of pretending," she said. "Tired of sharing. Tired of everyone walking on eggshells around you." There it was. Not concern. Not curiosity. Resentment. I realized then that whatever the test said, Rachel had already decided who I was to her. I asked her to leave. She laughed, standing up slowly. "Fine," she said. "But don't act surprised when you're the last to know the truth about yourself." After she left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the life I'd built without them, and for the first time I didn't feel small. I felt cornered, yes, but also clear. The manipulation had escalated to a point where pretending ignorance was no longer an option. They were pushing me toward a cliff, confident I'd step off just to keep the peace. What they didn't see was that I had stopped trying to keep the peace. I was still silent, still outwardly compliant, but inside something had shifted from endurance to resolve. I wasn't planning revenge yet. I wasn't plotting exposure. I was simply paying attention, letting them reveal exactly who they were, and trusting that truth, real truth, has a way of surfacing when people are too busy performing to notice the ground giving way beneath them. After Rachel left my apartment that night, the silence that followed felt different from all the silences before it, heavier but also clearer, like the air after a storm when everything sharpens into focus. I didn't rush to do anything dramatic, didn't confront my parents, didn't suddenly announce boundaries, because I understood instinctively that reacting would only feed the story they were already telling about me. Instead, I stepped back and started observing my family the way you might observe strangers whose behavior you're trying to understand, noting patterns, inconsistencies, small slips that people make when they assume they're in control. I reread old messages between my parents and me, noticing how often affection was conditional, tied to compliance, how concern appeared only when I disrupted the narrative. I replayed conversations in my head, hearing new meanings in familiar phrases, realizing how often my feelings had been reframed as inconveniences. Quietly, without telling anyone, I scheduled an appointment with a therapist, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted clarity, a neutral space where I could speak freely without being minimized. In those sessions, as I talked through years of favoritism and subtle humiliation, something important happened. The doubt I'd carried for so long began to loosen its grip. My therapist never told me what to do, never pushed me toward confrontation or forgiveness. She simply helped me see that my reactions were reasonable, that the pain wasn't imaginary, that enduring harm silently doesn't make you strong, it just makes the harm harder to see. Around the same time, I started organizing the evidence I'd been collecting, not obsessively, not with revenge in mind, but methodically. Screenshots went into folders labeled by date. I wrote down incidents as they happened, sticking to facts, exact words, witnesses. It felt strange at first, like I was preparing for a trial I didn't know would happen, but it also felt grounding, like I was anchoring my reality somewhere solid after years of being told it was unstable. Rachel continued her campaign, but I stopped engaging altogether. When she texted, I didn't respond. When my mother called, I let it go to voicemail, then listened later, noting the tone, the language, the way concern blurred into accusation. "We're worried about you," my mother said in one message. "This distance isn't healthy." What she meant was that my silence was disrupting their comfort. I noticed how quickly worry turned into irritation when I didn't fall back into line. My father sent a single message asking if we could talk like adults. I replied that I was open to a conversation with a neutral third party present. He never responded. That told me everything I needed to know. They didn't want dialogue. They wanted compliance. During this time, I finally decided to take a DNA test, but not the one Rachel gave me and not on her timeline. I ordered my own through a medical provider privately without telling anyone. It wasn't about appeasing them anymore. It was about removing a question that had been weaponized against me. When the kit arrived, I didn't feel fear or anticipation. I felt detached, steady. I followed the instructions, sealed the sample, and mailed it without ceremony. Then I went back to living my life. Work became a refuge, not because I was avoiding the situation, but because it reminded me of who I was outside my family's version of me. Colleagues respected me. My manager valued my input. No one questioned my legitimacy or laughed at my pain. That contrast was stark and quietly validating. Meanwhile, Rachel grew louder in my absence. She called mutual acquaintances, fishing for information, framing my distance as instability. "She's always been emotional," she'd say, a familiar line delivered with practiced concern. What she didn't realize was that people talk, and not everyone was as invested in protecting her image as my parents were. A friend mentioned offhand that Rachel seemed obsessed, that the situation felt mean-spirited. I filed that away, not to use, just to remember that reality still existed outside my family bubble. When the test results came back, I didn't open them right away. I let the envelope sit on my desk for 2 days, not out of fear, but because I wanted to be sure of something first. I asked myself who I would be if the results said what Rachel implied, and who I would be if they didn't. The answer was the same. I was still Emily. Still the woman who had endured years of quiet exclusion without losing her sense of right and wrong. Still someone who deserved basic respect regardless of biology. That realization was more important than any document. When I finally opened the results, I read them carefully, then read them again. The truth was clear, unambiguous, backed by data and medical language that left no room for jokes or reinterpretation. I felt a brief flicker of something like grief, not because of what the results said, but because of what they exposed about my family. They had been willing to destroy me over a question that never should have mattered. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send screenshots. I didn't confront Rachel. Instead, I made appointments, spoke to a lawyer recommended by a colleague, and asked questions about defamation, harassment, and public humiliation. I wasn't looking to sue anyone, not yet, but I wanted to understand my options, the boundaries of accountability. Knowledge felt like armor. My lawyer listened without interrupting, reviewed the documentation I'd gathered, and said something that stayed with me. You've been remarkably patient. Patience is admirable, but it doesn't obligate you to tolerate abuse. That sentence settled into me like a final piece clicking into place. I understood then that whatever came next didn't need to be loud or cruel. It just needed to be truthful, timed correctly, and impossible to dismiss. So I waited. I attended family events less frequently, declined invitations politely, kept my tone neutral. Rachel interpreted this as weakness, as withdrawal, and grew bolder, telling my parents I was clearly hiding something. My parents, convinced they were being reasonable, decided it was time for a family meeting, something formal, something final, where everything could be put to rest. They invited me to dinner, asked Rachel to be there, and framed it as a chance to clear the air. I agreed immediately. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I was finally ready to stop carrying the weight of their assumptions alone. I showed up calm, prepared, and very aware that for the first time, I wasn't walking into that room without support, without clarity, or without the truth firmly in my hands. The dinner was scheduled for a Thursday evening at my parents' house, the same table where my birthday had unraveled, and when I arrived, everything was arranged to look calm and reasonable, as if atmosphere alone could rewrite history. My mother had cooked my sister's favorite meal, the one she always made when she wanted to smooth things over, and my father greeted me with a careful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Rachel was already there, sitting comfortably, confident, her posture relaxed in the way it only ever was when she believed she was winning. "I'm glad you finally agreed to talk," she said, as if this had been my stubborn delay instead of their pressure. I took my seat without responding, placed my bag beside my chair, and folded my hands in my lap, feeling an unexpected sense of calm. My mother cleared her throat and began with practiced concern. "We just want honesty," she said. "This situation has gone on long enough." Rachel nodded vigorously. "Exactly. We're all adults here. If there's something we need to know, now's the time." I listened, letting them speak, noting how often they used words like we and family while positioning me as the problem. When there was a pause, my father looked at me and said, "Emily, have you taken the test?" I met his gaze and said evenly, "Yes." Rachel's smile sharpened. "Finally," she said. "And?" I didn't answer her. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed a sealed folder on the table, sliding it toward the center. "Before we get to that," I said, "I want us to have this conversation properly." My mother frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" That was when the doorbell rang. The sound cut cleanly through the tension and everyone froze. My father stood up, confused, and went to answer it. Moments later, he returned with a man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. "Hello," the man said calmly. "I'm Daniel Morris, a family law attorney. Emily asked me to be present as a neutral third party." Rachel laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "You brought a lawyer? Are you serious?" I nodded. "Very." My mother's face tightened. "This is unnecessary." Daniel remained standing, professional, composed. "My role here is simply to ensure clarity and prevent misrepresentation. If you'd like, I can leave." No one asked him to. Silence filled the space again, heavier now, charged. Rachel crossed her arms. "Fine," she said. "Let's get on with it. What do the results say?" I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, and took out 2 documents, placing them side by side on the table. "These are certified DNA test results conducted through a medical provider," I said. "Not a novelty kit. Not a joke." I slid the first page toward my father. "According to this, you are my biological parent." The words landed quietly, without flourish, and for a moment no one spoke. My father stared at the page, his face unreadable. My mother leaned over his shoulder, reading quickly, then looked up at me, confusion flickering into something like relief. Rachel's smile faltered. "That doesn't prove anything," she said. "Those tests can be faked." Daniel stepped forward slightly. "These results are legally admissible and verifiable," he said. But there's more. I took a breath and turned the second document toward the center. This, I said, is a record of the harassment and defamation I've experienced over the past several months, including screenshots of messages, social media posts, and witness statements. Rachel scoffed. You're being ridiculous. Daniel didn't raise his voice, but his tone sharpened, publicly implying that someone is illegitimate, mentally unstable, or deceptive, especially in a repeated and documented manner, can meet the legal threshold for defamation and harassment. My mother looked between us, alarm creeping in. We never meant any harm, she said quickly. This was just a misunderstanding. I finally looked directly at Rachel. You called me another man's mistake in front of our family, I said. You gave me a DNA test as a joke on my birthday. You posted insinuations online. You brought it up repeatedly in public. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a pattern. Rachel's face flushed. You're twisting things, she snapped. Everyone knows you're dramatic. Daniel opened his briefcase and removed a tablet, turning it on and placing it on the table. These are recordings Emily was legally permitted to make, he said, including a voicemail from you, Rachel, stating that you were tired of pretending and tired of sharing. The room went completely still. My father's head snapped up, his eyes moving to Rachel. What does that mean? Rachel stood abruptly. This is insane, she said. You're all ganging up on me. I spoke then, my voice steady, not raised. I didn't bring him here to punish you. I brought him here to stop this. I turned to my parents. You let this happen. You watched me be humiliated and called it sensitivity. You chose comfort over fairness. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stop. The test proves what I already knew. I belong. But the way you treated me proves something else entirely. Daniel closed the folder gently. At this time, Emily is not pursuing legal action, he said. However, if the behavior continues, she has grounds to do so. The power in the room had shifted completely. Rachel looked around, searching for support, but my parents were silent now, confronted with evidence they couldn't dismiss. My father finally spoke, his voice low. Rachel, he said. Apologize. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her confidence gone. I stood up, gathering my bag. I didn't come here for an apology, I said. I came here for the truth to be said out loud. And with that, I walked toward the door, leaving them behind in a silence they could no longer fill with jokes or doubt. I didn't look back when I walked out of my parents' house that night, not because I was angry, but because for the first time in my life I didn't feel the need to measure my steps by their reactions. The drive home was quiet, steady, my hands relaxed on the steering wheel as the weight I'd carried for decades finally began to lift. Not all at once, but enough to breathe more freely. In the days that followed, the fallout unfolded exactly as you'd expect when a long-protected illusion collapses. My mother called first, her voice soft, fragile, apologetic in a way it had never been before, telling me she hadn't realized how bad it was, that she thought she was keeping the peace, that she never meant for Rachel to hurt me. I listened without interrupting, then told her calmly that intentions don't erase impact, and that I needed time before deciding what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted moving forward. My father sent a long email instead of calling, admitting that he'd avoided conflict because it felt easier than standing up to Rachel, acknowledging that he'd failed me by choosing silence when I needed protection. It wasn't a dramatic confession, but it was honest, and for the first time it didn't come with a request for me to smooth things over. Rachel didn't reach out at all. I heard through a relative that she was furious, telling anyone who would listen that I'd embarrassed her, that I'd gone nuclear over nothing. But her words no longer had the same reach. Without my parents reinforcing her version of events, her narrative lost its power. Family gatherings became quieter, more cautious. Jokes at my expense stopped completely. When my name came up, it was spoken carefully, like people were finally aware it belonged to a real person with boundaries. I noticed the shift most clearly in myself. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head before making a simple phone call. Therapy sessions turned from unpacking pain to building something new, something steady. I didn't rush forgiveness and I didn't seek revenge. Justice, I learned, doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like clarity that can't be undone. Months later, my parents asked if I would meet them for coffee, Just the three of us. I agreed on my terms in a public place. The conversation was awkward, careful, but different. They listened more than they spoke. They didn't minimize or redirect. When my mother apologized again, it wasn't followed by excuses. When my father said he was proud of me, it wasn't conditional. I didn't pretend that everything was fixed, but I allowed space for something healthier to exist slowly, honestly. Rachel remained distant, and I made peace with that. Not every relationship survives the loss of control, and I stopped seeing that as a failure. What mattered was that I no longer questioned my worth when she wasn't in the room. The DNA test that had been meant to humiliate me now sat forgotten in a file drawer, irrelevant. Biology had never been the real issue. The truth was simpler and harder. I had been the convenient outlet for a family that didn't want to confront its own imbalance. Once that truth was exposed, everything changed. I built a life that didn't revolve around proving I deserved kindness. I surrounded myself with people who didn't need jokes at my expense to feel secure. And when I think back to that birthday, to the envelope slid across the table, to the laughter that followed, I don't feel the sting I once did. I feel gratitude for the moment that forced me to stop shrinking, to stop enduring quietly, to finally choose myself without apology. I didn't win by destroying anyone. I won by refusing to let my identity be defined by someone else's cruelty. And that, more than any test result, was the proof that mattered. If you enjoy powerful family drama stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more.